Work Wellness Institute is transforming research into workplace performance and health. As an organization, we function throughout the complete cycle of turning research into practice, mobilizing knowledge as a research institute, community partner, funder, and educational provider. Our mission of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces for all is our driving motivation. Learning is a lifelong journey to adapt to the forever changing needs of the workplace. Whether you are a leader, a professional, an academic, or a student, we provide high-quality resources that are evidence-based, topical, and relevant to all industries. Choose the Work Wellness Institute as your learning journey partner and become a member to gain full access to our diverse knowledge mobilization programming, including lectures on demand, e-curriculum, 3 distinct certification opportunities, and more. Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we can support transforming research into performance and health for your workplace.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in today's annual general meeting event. Today's webinar topic is Exploring the Landscape of Gig Work for People with Disabilities. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Manager of Programs and Operations with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We would like to start by acknowledging that we have the privilege to host this event from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. This webinar is made possible through the support of the funders, partners, as well as memberships to Work Wellness Institute. We thank our advisory committee and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. Today, we're excited to welcome our own Work Wellness Institute research team, Dr. Cameron Stockdale, Dr. Janessa Griffith, and Sydney Penner, on the topic of exploring the landscape of gig work for people with disabilities. Dr. Cameron Stockdale, an executive leader and scholar in the fields of leadership, innovation, technology, law, and organizational behavior, brings his extensive experience in guiding positive change within organizations. Emphasizing an approach of ongoing growth and refinement, his work focuses on increasing efficiencies of bolstering team performance. As the CEO of the Work Wellness Institute, Dr. Stockdale's goal is to make research more accessible for workplaces and employers with a focus on workplace health, wellness, and performance issues. Dr. Janessa Griffith is the research director at the Work Wellness Institute. She holds a PhD in medical science from the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on bridging the gap between research and implementation. Recently, Janessa conducted research on vaccine hesitancy in Canada, which gained national and international media coverage and was recognized by the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, and Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Theresa Tam. Sydney Penner is a research assistant at the Work Wellness Institute. She holds a BA in psychology from Simon Fraser University. Her research focuses on concurrent mental disorders and substance use, with an emphasis on sleep rhythms. Most recently, Sydney conducted a sleep study in a psychiatric inpatient population and founded a mental health knowledge translation podcast that was presented at the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research Put in Patient First Conference and featured by the Canadian Psychology Association. Cam, Janessa, and Sydney, we're excited to learn from you today. So without wait, I will let Cam take over with opening remarks.
Thank you, Yusra, and good morning, all. I'm going to be very quick and very brief, and we'll get to the heart of the matter with Janessa and Sydney here in a few minutes. But we thought it was worthwhile to really give a bit of a background with respect to this project, because it's a good example of the work that we do here in the organization. This project, the genesis of this project, really started with our stakeholders. It started with those organizations and those companies that work with us on a regular basis, that call us and ask us for advice on topics. So they were talking about how, coming out of COVID, The traditional models of work have been really rapidly changing, that they were looking at people to hire people on contracts. They were looking at people that needed that flexible work time. And we really started talking to these organizations about the gig economy. Uh, in our organization, we do have a focus in looking at disabilities in the workplace. And so there was this natural question about what is the impact of the gig economy on those with disabilities? And that question really resonated with those employers that we are working with. Those with disabilities, we know from the research, prior research, that they are traditionally unemployed or underemployed for the skill sets that they have. And when you work in a gig economy, you're in essence, you don't have access to things like dental plans or medical coverage. You potentially, you're your own employer, so there's occupational health and safety issues potentially in gig work. And so we put together a research project, and then we went and sought funding for it. We went out, we made a couple of applications, and the Future Skills Center looked at what we were proposing and thought that this was a great topic, and really spoke to what the Future Skills Center was trying to do. So we received some funding to create this project. I believe it was last November that we actually made the application. And so you can see from the application or the proposal going in to getting it approved to actually coming out with knowledge mobilization tools and papers. It has been a very quick turnaround. And that's what we try to do here in the organization. We try to rapidly do or find research and turn that into usable tools for our employers. So with that introduction, I think you're probably here to listen to Janessa and Sydney more than I am, and I'll turn it over to them. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Cam. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, thanks so much. So as Yusra and Cam mentioned, my name is Janessa, and I'm very excited today to be talking to you about our study called Gig Workers with Disabilities in Canada. I'm going to be presenting the first part, and then I will hand it over to my colleague, Sydney, who will be discussing more on this topic. So in doing this research, when we started out, we realized that a lot of people had different ideas of what the gig economy meant. So the definition of this, it's an umbrella term that covers basically non-standard, non-traditional types of work. So it can be sole proprietors, business owners that are more like sole proprietors, independent contractors, contingent workers. I think it brings it to life a little bit more when we think of examples of this. So people who maybe work for TaskRabbit, who build furniture like IKEA furniture. People who drive for Uber or do deliveries through Uber Eats or DoorDash. People who work maybe like a graphic design, a quick, building a logo for somebody on Fiverr. It doesn't always have to be web-based. It can be like somebody puts up an ad for somebody looking to paint a house or somebody to set up chairs at a wedding. But with the advent of cell phones, more digital gig work has become quite popular. The pandemic, of course, was a bit of a catalyst for this. So as of 2023, the population of people working in gig work in Canada, so this is people generally, not just people living with disabilities, but people generally, and they might do this on the side too, not full time, but this rose to 8.75 million in Canada, and our total population is 40 million. So, this is quite significant and something that we should be dedicating some time to studying. Why the sudden increase with COVID? Well, if we can think back, there were lots of layoffs, business closures. It was kind of this time that acted as a catalyst for change, and this was something that came out of it. So certainly wasn't new from the pandemic, but it did act as kind of a moment that increased the number of people doing gig work. We've seen it kind of rise a little bit in some headlines. We see it's in the Globe and Mail. There's been some articles about it. It is an interesting topic, and yeah, certainly not new, but with the digital gig economy on the rise and with the pandemic being a catalyst, this is a really crucial time to collect data. So some things that we don't really know and we want to know more about is understanding like earning potential, working conditions of people in the gig economy. We want to look at focusing on workers' rights and protections, and identifying gig workers who, what industries it's most prevalent in. Is it transportation? Is it deliveries? Is there something that we're totally not thinking of? So we wanted to know a little bit more about this topic. And we wanted to focus on people living with disabilities, because people living with disabilities, it's been documented, often are excluded from traditional employment opportunities. It can be difficult to hold a job if somebody's having to go to lots of appointments or has maybe a chronic condition that maybe they have good days and bad days. And with COVID, it was increased because, people were having to take time off if they had COVID during the more acute phases of COVID, or people who have long COVID and have to deal with that on a daily basis. So gig work then becomes a viable, sorry, I'm just moving the images so I can see the PowerPoint. Gig work may be a viable employment avenue for people with living with disabilities, because as you can imagine, it offers that flexibility and autonomy, but we really didn't have data to back this up. So we wanted to know more about what this looked like. We also wanted to know what the downsides were. Of course, we could brainstorm, but we wanted to know from what was already available in the literature and from people who actually have lived experiences. So the aims of this study were that we wanted to synthesize existing literature. We wanted to know if we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So we wanted to see what's already known and look for any gaps in the literature. We also wanted to examine what are the benefits, what are the drawbacks, what are the challenges, what are the strengths of gig work for people living with disabilities. And we wanted to hear recommendations from people who actually have this lived experience to know what would make life better in the gig economy. How can we protect these workers? So to tackle those types of broad research questions, we undertook 2 studies, which are basically one kind of fed into the other. So one was a scoping review, which I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides. And then after that, I'll pass it to Sydney, who will be talking about the qualitative interviews that we did. So the scoping review is basically just a literature search. We're wanting to know, what have other people already said about the gig economy and people living with disabilities? And then from that, we made some new research questions and were able to really refine what we were looking for. And we were able to find what other researchers couldn't find before. We were able to do that through our qualitative interviews. So it's kind of a 2-step study. And just to get everybody on the same page with some definitions for the research. So this is for both the scoping review, the literature search, and for the qualitative study. So when we define disability, we did it according to the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. And they define disability as including people who have physical, mental, and invisible illnesses and limitations, developmental and learning disabilities, addictions, and acute injuries. So it's a we took a broad definition. Now, our exclusion and exclusion criteria. So when we, as I mentioned, when we were kind of refining how we would go about this project, we had lots of discussions of who we would include and who we would exclude, because we thought, well, should we include people who are doing this just kind of like they have a full-time job, but they're doing it in addition to that? And we thought, no, that kind of brings about a different type of motivation for doing this type of work. So our inclusion was that it had to be people in gig work who had no benefits or overtime, like a position that wouldn't have those types of extended benefits, no paid leave. It had to be the person's primary source of income. It could include under the table work. They could be sole proprietors and 0-hour contract workers. And then they would be people who self-identify as having one or more disabilities. We excluded temporary workers. We excluded business owners other than sole proprietors. And some of this we had to do kind of on a case-by-case basis. As you can imagine, there's lots of gray in between that. It's not so black and white. It couldn't be what people refer to as side hustles. So it couldn't just be, like after work doing some Uber for a couple hours. It couldn't include criminal work. It couldn't include passive income. And it couldn't be somebody who didn't identify with a disability. So it had to be somebody who had a disability. So as I said, when we're doing a literature search, we really wanted to cast our net wide because we wanted to know what other people had already discovered about the gig economy and living with a disability. And we weren't concerned just about Canada. We wanted to know across the world what is going on. So we looked at publications like academic papers that had been published. And we also searched the internet for gray literature. So gray literature just meaning like websites that talk about the gig economy and living with a disability. Different organizations that might produce like a report or a white paper, or it could be other not-for-profits. It could be government websites, things like that. We scoured the internet high and low. We ended up getting just over 11,000 articles that were published. And then we got a handful of things on the internet that were relevant. When we whittled it down to things that were actually relevant to us, and this is very normal for any literature search, you start with a big number like 12,000 and it seems overwhelming, but we go by it. Sydney and I went through it individually, record by record, to see what would be relevant to us. And then it gets whittled down. And eventually we found 57 studies, 57 articles or information online that were relevant. So not tons, but it was manageable because we could see what other people were talking about in the literature. And what we found was we broke it down into push and pull factors. So that's pushing, meaning like people felt like they were pushed into the gig economy, and pull factors, meaning that people were more drawn into the gig economy because of its perks or benefits. And through what was already available through this literature search, we found people were pushed into it because people living with disabilities found that they weren't able to access traditional employment opportunities. They may have faced stigma or discrimination in the workplace, or even in the hiring process. They might not have been receiving the necessary accommodations to be able to work. They could have been let go consistently or struggling to maintain a job. Whereas the pull factors, so things that influenced people to seek employment in the gig economy, they were attracted to flexible hours, being able to make your own schedule. If you're an Uber driver, if you're an Uber driver and you like to stay up late, then maybe you can choose your own hours that way, or it goes with your disability. Maybe you're able to, if you have a chronic condition, you're able to work when you feel good and take the time off when you need to take time off or see a physician. People liked being able to work from home or work wherever, like at a cafe or, across the country. People like to have more autonomy, not have a traditional boss. And some people were interested in developing new or different skills. So in our more methodological stance, when we were going through this literature, we were able to sometimes break it down by disability type. So here in the first column, we have the types of disability, like mental, physical, cognitive, developmental, cases where people had multiple conditions, and then unspecified or injury. And then across on the rows going horizontally, we have the push factors, the pull factors, people who were both pushed and pulled, and then where it wasn't identified. And what's interesting about this is that, well, the top category is unspecified. So that's not super helpful because we don't know what type of disability. But in that unspecified, which was the biggest proportion of almost 40%, people were mostly pushed, but they were also both pushed and pulled. But again, not super helpful because we don't know what particular type of disability it was. When we look at just articles, whether that was like reports or it was from the academic literature, when we looked at mental health specifically, people were both 70% of those articles reported people being both pushed and pulled. And then when we go to physical disabilities, that was the other interesting category. People were equally pushed, pulled, both pushed and pulled, and then also not reported. So those were kind of the main findings of that. People could be both pushed and pulled, but in the mental health where we have more data, people did see attractive parts to it and unattractive parts. What we thought, like for us wrapping up more of the literature search, which led into the next phase of the study, we thought specifying disability type is crucial. Because we can't paint all people with the same brush. We can't paint all disabilities with the same brush. So it's important for us to be able to stratify by type of disability if we're going to think about ways to help people, if we're going to think about how policies can be changed or what workplace accommodations might be necessary. We want to know who it works for and in what circumstances. And we just weren't finding that in the literature, so that was a big gap. We through the gaps that we found, we were able to have a better understanding of how people living with disabilities are managing in the gig economy. We wanted to know more about this. So in our next phase of the study, we were hoping to have a better understanding. And we wanted to get at the role intersectionality plays. So the intersection of different types of inequities and how that plays a role in the gig economy. And we wanted to investigate the sustainability of gig work in the long term. So with those, like, illuminating those gaps in the research, we were really motivated for the next phase of the study, which was interviewing people who are actually working in the gig economy. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Sydney Penner, who is going to be leading us through the next phase of the study.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Janessa. Just give me a moment here while I pop up to share. All right, so more on the qualitative side. So we took all that information and we funneled it into first a demographic survey with folks, then some semi-structured interviews, and then kind of took all that together and put it into themes that discussed positives, negatives, and the future directions that are kind of in these emergent themes. So just a little bit of background on some ethics issues here. We recruited people a little bit through the professional networks of the Work Wellness Institute, but we ended up with our sample actually coming from the social media advertisement campaign that we ran on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So on the right-hand side, I just have a little sample here of what one of our advertisements looked like that went up. So yeah, people were given a consent form and they went through an eligibility screener when they were randomly selected from that pool of folks who expressed interest in participating. And then those that were selected ended up with a $50 e-gift card of their choice. And yeah, that's kind of how things went from a recruitment and ethics perspective. So a little bit more on our interview guide. So we kind of started by asking people just generally about their work history, what brought you into gig work, how did you end up here? And then moved from that into if they could identify positive experiences with us, of like things that they've done in gig work that they felt good about, things that they enjoyed about the work, negative experiences, so basically just the polar opposite of that. Then kind of looking more broadly at the impact that gig work has had on their health, their wellness, and particularly their disability or disabilities, depending on if they had multiple. Then we actually focused again on kind of framing this in an ideal world. Would you rather be involved in gig work or in traditional employment? And then we moved into just asking them about their kind of recommendations to improve the gig economy for themselves and people like them moving forward. So we ended up with 21 interview participants and 19 of those completed their demographic survey. So we missed a few people who either elected not to do this part of the study or just non-response. And just want to pull out a few notable demographics here that kind of help give us a better landscape of who ended up chatting with us. So they're a young group, 26 years old with a standard deviation of about 3 years on the other side of that. Fairly representative gender-wise, 53% men, 42% women, and 5% non-binary. We did end up with 85% of people identifying as Black, 10% identifying as white, and then 5% saying they were just one or more population group. Disability type, we chose to kind of just divide it by a physical limitation, a mental limitation, or something comorbid. So 80% of folks ended up in the physical category, 10% in mental, and then 10% saying they had both going on at one time. And then a little bit more about the community environment they're working in. So almost 70% of people said that they work in an urban area, which isn't surprising. There's probably a higher percentage of available gig work available there. And then 25% said that they were in more of a suburban kind of environment, and only 6% saying that they were kind of fairly remote. Socioeconomically, there were some interesting things we pulled in the demographics as well. So we asked about household income bracket, And unsurprisingly, we had 31% saying that they were making between $15,000 but less than $30,000 a year, and then 19% saying less than $15,000. So basically, what you can see here is that the majority of the sample is making under $60,000, and a decent portion of that is under $30,000. That's obviously not super encouraging. That's a fairly low amount of income to make in our country with rising inflation. And then we have this one outlier who said that they were making between $105,000 and $120,000 a year. So that was a little bit interesting. Level of education we also asked about, again, with 56% saying that they had a bachelor's degree complete, which is a little bit interesting, not maybe what we would have expected. We maybe would have thought that people wouldn't be meeting some of those educational targets. And obviously no one's saying that they had something like a professional or master's degree completed. Then I actually would like to have us do a poll at this point, because I also think that in capturing socioeconomics, it's interesting to have people look at their financial circumstances from more of like an abstract and self-report lens. So rather than just looking at what their income level is, we also wanted to ask them to describe their financial circumstances. So do they feel like they don't have enough to pay some of their bills no matter how hard they try? Enough to pay their bills, but they've had to cut back? Do they feel like they have enough to pay bills without cutting back, but they don't really have room for those extra fun things in life? Or do they actually have enough money for extras? So I have some figures here, 27%, 67%, 7%, and 0%. And I would poll and ask people to share where they think 67% of the sample identified. So I'll just give that a moment. And then once we're done, maybe Yusra, we want to share the results. All right, so looks like you guys are saying that you think that 67% of the sample says that they have not enough to pay some bills no matter how hard they try. A couple of you, about a quarter of you, think that people say they have enough to pay bills, but they've had to cut back. Obviously, no one's saying that we have enough to pay for extras, and 13% of you think that people have enough to pay their bills without cutting back, but they can't afford extras. So where did we actually end up? 67% of people said that they do have enough to pay their bills, but they've had to cut back. So not surprising, I probably would have voted the same way and said that we don't have enough to pay our bills. So that's a little bit of an encouraging result that we've seen that at least they're sort of making ends meet. They're maybe not living a super comfortable life, but at the end of the day, they're able to pull through. All right. And then the last thing we asked about in demographics, which was obviously a really important part of this study, was where are they gigging? Where are they working? So we kind of broke it down into a number of different industries that were kind of identified through the scoping review literature, and just some notable things to pull out here. So we looked at manufacturing, kind of courier services, being like food deliveries, stuff like that, transportation, being Uber, Lyft drivers, freelance artisans, people who sell stuff on Etsy, general labor and tasking, people who are on TaskRabbit, putting furniture together, digital services, agriculture, and then other. We did actually leave a box for people to kind of specify what other meant to them when they reported that, but people didn't. So then obviously we also pulled the hours of work that they are doing in a typical week in the gig economy, and that rounded out to about 30 with a significant amount of variation, which is to be expected working in that industry. So a couple notable things here, in my view, would be that 50% of people said that they never work in transportation. So they're not ever working as an Uber or Lyft driver. But I guess also if they have a physical limitation, that could play into that. 38% said they don't do any general labor or tasking. 19% say that they do agriculture most of the time. And unsurprisingly, 38% of people said that they do kind of digital work most of the time. 14% said all the time. So that's a significant category that really came out here. All right, so moving into some of the interview themes, I mentioned that we kind of broke things down by positives, negatives, and then future directions we want to move in. So when we looked at things that people mentioned that were positive aspects of gig work for them, obviously flexibility and autonomy came out on in significant amounts. So flexibility being a big one at 76%. 48% of people actually said that meeting new people was something that was a good experience for them and that they preferred. 38% autonomy, 43% saying that they felt like they had a sense of purpose in their work, and then almost 30% saying that they also enjoyed the ability to pick up new skills. So just want to point to some of the quotes that people mentioned here that I kind of thought had some impact to them. So one person mentions, I can dictate when I deliver work. It kind of gives me time to do other things and I can work at my own pace. Another person says, I think working gig is giving me another shot at life. I have people who really depend on my services. So I think it's interesting that there are some mental health benefits that people are identifying to working in the gig economy, rather than just mental health challenges and stresses. On the other side, however, there were definitely more negative themes, as you could see, that came out. The negativity that was present throughout the conversations we had with these folks was a much more felt atmosphere than the positive sense. A lot of people spoke to the lack of stability from an income perspective and just not having work coming their way. 52% saying that lack of paid time off and benefits was a huge issue for them. Then we had things come out like discrimination and stigma, that people said that they were either feeling in a kind of like an atmosphere of stigma towards them as someone with a disability, and 48% saying that they'd actually had tangible experiences with people kind of vocalizing discriminatory things or behaving violently towards them. 43% said that the work negatively impacts their disability, either from the sense that it's just super stressful and that kind of feeds into having poor health. And then 29% said that they don't like the long and late hours that they have to work. And 24% said that there's the lack of regulations is really difficult. So again, some notable things to pull out here. One participant mentioned the aspect of me not having enough money to take care of myself has affected me the most. I'm just trying to manage because I also have to take care of my sick mom. And I pulled this one out because I think it really speaks to the fact that we never know about the layers of responsibilities that people have, even when they're gig workers. This person has a disability, they're not making ends meet for themselves, but they're also a primary caregiver for somebody else who clearly has some sort of disability or illness wrong with them. Another person mentioned when you work with a company more in regular employment, there's always insurance to cover healthcare. In gig work, you're just expected to be able to pay for everything that you need. And personally, I would pull that out because I would say, yet again, we get into this kind of strange world where we have people who are not necessarily making use of their extended health benefits who are able to hold a traditional job because they don't need the benefits that much. And then people who are gig workers who have significant disabilities don't have access to this, and they may be the people that need the services the most and don't have access to employment. So moving out of that negativity, back again into hopefully some ways that we can make a difference in the future. People had a lot to say about what their recommendations were for the future of gig work, especially for folks with disabilities, but they also spoke more generally about the gig economy. They feel like people should be educated both about what the gig economy is, what the issues in it currently are, and how it intersects with people who have disabilities. They felt that the government should be responsible for providing them more protections in terms of even like portable benefits options, workplace health and safety. They felt they should have more support from either direct employers who kind of contract their work, or from these organizations that are kind of larger overhead things like Uber and Lyft, in terms of making their wages more livable, all that kind of stuff. And then 33% of them said that they also thought maybe like a gig workers association or board would be an interesting idea. A space where they can kind of gather their thoughts on what is wrong with the gig economy and how they perceive differently how it could be resolved. So one person mentions there needs to be better regulation. There needs to be portable benefits options, even processes to support contracts with these employers, even legal resources. And that was something that I hadn't necessarily anticipated people chatting about, but it makes sense. Navigating paperwork and, 0 hours contracts and things like that is really daunting. And a lot of people don't have those skill sets, and they could end up kind of on the short end of that stick, if you want to call it that. Another person says, I know ergonomically I'm struggling, and that's a huge area that's lacking. I can't even imagine if you're an Uber driver or another type of gig worker, workplace safety is definitely a big thing in the gig economy. So yeah, they were rather vocal about what needs to happen in the future, and that was definitely appreciated on our end. We also asked, as I mentioned, about whether they felt kind of that push or pull to get into the gig economy. In our particular sample, which again, bear in mind that this was 80% of people identifying with having a physical limitation of some sort, 84% felt exclusively pushed and 16% felt pulled. And we also pulled this out in the qualitative data. Kind of, I'll give you an example of how we kind of analyze that language. So someone who we considered to be feeling pushed says, I've been hunting for jobs for quite a number of years now. I have bills to take care of, demands from family, my personal demands. So I had to look for an alternative to take care of myself. I had my hand amputated and I tried to apply some places, but I think they saw me as not physically fit enough for the work. So I had to go into work that would be able to accommodate me given my disability. Versus somebody who felt a little bit more attracted to go in, it says, I decided to go ahead with freelance gig because it's easier for me. I can stay at home and do a lot of work without having to answer to somebody like you do when you work in an office. So just kind of noting the difference in language here, right? Between someone saying, I had to go into the work because I wasn't able to get something else and I needed those accommodations, versus someone saying, I decided to go ahead with this because I like to be at home and I like to not have to answer to somebody. So just kind of pulling that out a bit as well. And then I just kind of want to wrap up with some of those negative themes that came out, especially around discrimination and stigma, might not have been things we were expecting in this population. And it was kind of something that was on people's minds. This person mentioned everyone should be educated not to look down on people with disabilities and to provide a supportive environment for them. And I definitely think that that's a really important aspect of supporting people living with disabilities in both traditional employment and in the gig economy. So just, yeah, thought that was an interesting quote. So to sum it all up, we kind of had some expected outcomes of our conversations with gig workers with disabilities, and then we had things that I would say were a bit more unexpected. So on the expected side, people basically felt that their health and their disability was negatively impacted by that financial insecurity, not having the benefits and the paid time off. And that makes sense, right? It kind of goes into this cycle where you don't have enough money and you don't have access to the proper care for your disability. And then the background stress also negatively influences your physical and mental health. On the other hand, they felt that their health and disability was positively impacted by having those flexible hours and the flexible work environment, and then having that ability to say, this isn't really a task that I feel I'm up to anymore, and maybe I have other skills, so I'm going to kind of shift into a different area of gig work. Unexpected wise, advantages of gig work, I don't know if we were expecting that people would say that it provided them a strong sense of purpose and that they felt like they had an ability to meet new people and kind of connect to the world around them. Just given the transient kind of nature of being in the gig industry, I don't know that we would have expected that they would feel kind of those ties to their work in a positive sense, but it's good to know. Drawback wise, again, discrimination and stigma, disability, gender, and racial related, all of those forms were noted in our sample. And again, just because of the transient nature of the work, I don't know that we would have expected that they would have faced those types of experiences, and that's discouraging to hear. And then again, the absence of legal and tax related resources that some folks chose to chat about is sort of one gap that we weren't outright looking for that came up. All right, so just a couple things to mention in terms of the limitations of this study and the future directions that we want to move in. So I would again point to the fact that there was that kind of unequal racial distribution in our sample, with 85% of folks identifying as Black. We have speculated that this could have been a faulty kind of part of our recruitment scheme. But I also would say that the folks that we screened for eligibility, they indicated they were coming from the Greater Toronto area, which we know is kind of a more concentrated area for a lot of Black Canadians to live in. So it could have also spoken to that. We did have a small sample size, of course, and then we didn't have a quantitative component for any of the health outcomes that we measured. So just in future, those are things that I think could be pulled out in studies that people kind of might jump off of from here. So yeah, I think moving forward, we could dissect differences between disability types a little bit more granularly than we chose to in the study, just by kind of dividing from physical to mental or having both comorbid at once. And then consider more mixed methods or quantitative approaches to examine a couple different questions, namely the relationship between the level of education and earning potential. Is it such that if you have a master's degree, maybe you have access to, contract work in the gig economy that comes at a higher price tag, or you have the ability to kind of negotiate that? The longitudinal health outcomes associated with gig work, I think, is especially important since, again, back to that Globe and Mail article that says, gig work is here to stay. There may be people who end up working in the gig economy for a long time, or just that's the only place they ever end up working. And we want to make sure that we know how that's impacting health in the longer run. And then obviously also further investigating the presence of discrimination in the gig economy and the role that intersectionality plays there. Like I mentioned, we did have people who spoke to instances of racial and gender discrimination when they were doing gigs. And that kind of, we need to look at that a little bit more, especially as folks who have those layered experiences of being someone with a disability and having all those other equity factors kind of stacked against them. So just a few kind of conclusions to wrap up. Like other forms of employment, gig work obviously comes with trade-offs. For some people with disabilities, it's going to be more advantageous than it is challenging, and it's going to be the opposite for other folks. But at the end of the day, I think it's just important that we highlight that the gig economy still has a really long way to go before it's kind of fully safe and equitable for everyone to participate in. And now I think that kind of wraps us up. So we can roll into some questions. If anyone from the audience has any, feel free to just drop them out. Hopefully we didn't go too fast and you caught all or the majority of that information, but yeah.
Thank you, Janessa and Sydney, for shedding some light on the benefits and drawback of gig work for people living with disabilities. A reminder to please insert your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And moving on to our first question, how does the experience of gig work differ between those with and without disabilities? And are there any noticeable differences?
That's a great question. Thank you for submitting that. Yeah, ours focused on people specifically who had disabilities, but in the future we could do something that compares gig work, generally, which we didn't do in this study. So it could be, it's definitely a gap. Looking at the literature too, it's pretty sparse. There's not much on the gig economy generally. And especially when it intersects with people who have disabilities. So definitely, I think that's something to look at in the future, but hard to answer without having done a study on that.
Thank you, Janessa. And then another question is, what can consumers of gig work do to be more supportive of this population?
I think there's a lot, honestly. I think tipping, if you're going to use those services rather than going and picking up your food yourself, just when we know that there's so much income instability going on there. I think obviously minding our behavior around people so that we're not contributing to these experiences of stigma and discrimination that are clearly felt by a lot of different folks. That's another one. And then as far as even what people pulled out in the recommendations, just again, for just this population and this particular sample, mentioning that the public needs to be educated. So coming to webinars like this, connecting with resources that kind of show you a better landscape of what's going on for the population, I think can help us just advocate for better policy reform, just kind of being connected to the conversation. So that's what I would say.
That's a really good point. Awareness is definitely the first step. And also, what areas of growth do you see in the experience of gig workers?
Ooh, that's a good question. Do you mean like areas of growth for like the different sectors, or areas of personal growth?
Well, we can go for both.
Yeah, I think the different sectors, like definitely, as I mentioned, the COVID was really a catalyst for change in many ways. But I think, yeah, the digital gig economy has certainly boomed because, you know, you just need your cell phone and people can sign up for, I mean, like depending on the type of work, if it's Uber, you certainly need like a car and a driver's license, but other things are maybe more accessible. So I don't, maybe I should think of a big idea like, a Zuckerberg type of idea for some type of gig work. But yeah, I think it's only growing. And I'm sure that there will be something that we haven't even thought of that will come up soon. Yeah, Sydney, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think you covered that, but we have an interesting question that's come through the chat here from
Oh.
Jasmine that I actually think we can speak to. So she says, apologies that I may have missed this in the scoping section, and I can understand why this would be much more manageable and realistic in terms of representative data. Working means exchange for labor for money. I'm curious about scenarios called many different things in different ways, contexts like an energy exchange. So we did actually make space for and had a lot of discussion about people who sort of do gig work that, yeah, it's not an exchange for money. It's an exchange for something else that they need. Janessa was particularly interested in this group of folks that are connected to Salt Spring Island who have like a little kind of gig economy group where they'll do something like, I need somebody to deliver some handmade soaps for me that I make from Salt Spring to Vancouver if you're going that way. And, you can feel free to have some of my products or whatever, if that's of interest to you, if you're already heading in that direction. So there were definitely other ways that kind of we were open to gig work being assessed in this study that might, I guess, kind of resemble something of a barter economy of sorts. But we didn't end up with anyone who kind of was involved in that, but we made space for that to be the case. Do you want to say anything else about that, Janessa?
Yeah, I think in the future, like if we had recruitment actually proved to be quite challenging. In the future, if we had more, like if we planned it so that when we applied for ethical review, if we could because we didn't have ethical approval to go through these types of communities, to like post in their chats, in their like Facebook forums. We didn't have permission to do that, so we couldn't do that. But I think in the future that is such an important part of the gig economy, or if you want to call that the like energy exchange, because yeah, I think there are lots of communities and spaces that do this type of like energy exchange, and we should be studying that as well.
Yeah, I think like you say, unfortunately that wasn't able to be involved in our recruitment strategy, so that's probably how we didn't end up getting anyone from there, but super important for the future. Another question we have asks, any recent resources that list the most common types of gig jobs and or recommended skills training areas? According to sort of the broader data that's been pulled in Canada and the US, digital services definitely remain at the top. Most commonly, people working in data entry, graphic design, even software and website development. So there are kind of these like broad soft skills, and then I would say highly specialized skills as well in terms of like coding and design and software navigation and abilities that we are seeing come out a lot that people are involved in. And that might filter into recommended skills training areas, basically kind of tracking with what we're seeing overall now, being able to use and navigate publicly available AIs and lots of different types of softwares, coding skills, a lot of it being that kind of heavily technological focused stuff, where you're just sitting behind a computer screen. So I would say outside of our study in the larger context, that's where most of the data has been. Would you say the same, Janessa?
Yeah, and it's interesting too that even gig work that isn't specifically digital. Like the same type of gig work would have been around like 30 years ago. Like, yeah, setting up wedding chairs at an event next Saturday, or like painting someone's door. Those types of things, while they could be listed on a paper poster at a grocery store or something, those tend to now be more like digitized. So that could be something on like even like Craigslist, which isn't the fanciest website by any means, but now they might be more on things like TaskRabbit. So even though they're like traditional gig types of work, like things that would have happened 30 years ago, now they're in this more like digital space now.
Absolutely. All right.
And thanks, Jasmine. I agree that I think for our next study, we'll have to do that.
Yes, for sure. All right. Any further questions, Yusra? Time for further questions, or?
I think we can squeeze in two more. So where do you see the next area of research focusing with this population?
Yeah, we put together a grant to, we haven't heard back. I think that one we might not hear back from for a couple months, but we're actually thinking about doing this type of research with some of our partners who work in the newcomer, immigrant, and refugee population. And looking at, so taking out the disability lens and looking at people who are new to Canada and seeing what types of support are needed in that space. We have had quite positive feedback, like generally from our partners, and even I don't know if Sydney can relate, but even when you're maybe like at a family dinner party, people generally are interested in the gig economy. It's an interesting topic. It's kind of, not that it's new, but the digital part of it is new. So I think there's definitely more work to be done, certainly in the literature. I know like 11,000 seems like a lot of articles, but 11,000 just meant that they had words like gig and economy somewhere in that, and we just had to like filter out tons. So the fact that there was only 57 articles on like the entire internet and the academic published literature means there's so much more work to be done, and we're just really scratching the surface. So the future directions are kind of, it's wide open, and there's lots of work to be done.
Absolutely. And then if we can wrap up with the last question, what stood out or what was striking to you while you were conducting this study?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I think some of the things we mentioned in the unexpected outcomes, particularly just, yeah, like I'll reiterate, because the work is transient and you kind of conceptualize it as somebody, like dropping a bag of food off on someone's door or just handing them a graphic design that they've done in the digital sphere. It might be a little bit different for people like Uber drivers who have a little bit more of a social component to their work. But I definitely wasn't expecting the kind of discriminatory and stigmatizing experiences that they would be encountering there. Especially some of the ones that were personal stories that people shared were surprising and discouraging to me in that respect. So that was probably the most significant surprising outcome that I think, again, speaking to this conversation of where should the research world go from here, something that we should definitely look at a little bit more closely. And again, like that role of intersectionality and how it plays and how safe the working conditions are, even for people. There's been some work in the US that's come out that has suggested, again, that Black gig workers in the US are facing really unsafe conditions compared to their white counterparts. So I think, yeah, that was something that I kind of got into a rabbit hole of after we uncovered it in our study, and seems important moving forward. Would you have anything different to add, Janessa?
Yeah, I think definitely the discrimination and stigma, I was expecting that to a certain extent, but just listening to our participants, some of their stories were quite heartbreaking. Like feeling, somebody was saying like they they felt like people weren't even treating them as humans. And that was just heartbreaking to hear that another human could treat a human that way. It was, yeah, pretty heavy stuff, some of the interviews. So that was unexpected. But it made, like, Sydney and I would debrief after, and it kind of, as hard as those stories are to hear, it made it all the more meaningful and important for us to do this work, because it's giving people a voice. And we're hoping with this study, it's not just a study that will be published in an academic paper that nobody will ever read. We're doing things for knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization for this, so that we can advocate for change and get these findings into the hands of people who can make decisions and help make informed policy decisions.
Well, thank you for this powerful information, and it just highlights the importance of the work you do. Again, thank you, Cam, Janessa, and Sydney, for your contribution, your research, and this extremely informative session.
Continue to learn and connect with the Work Wellness Institute and see how we're transforming research into workplace performance and health at www.workwellnessinstitute.org.